This week on the right side, ignorance causing forest fires in BC, the Alberta government doesn't seem concerned about another credit rating downgrade, Trudeau forgets to mention Alberta on July 1st and the CBC sweeps it under the rug, and Trudeau pays $10.5 million to Omar Khadr. This is The Right Side, episode 24, recorded Saturday, July 8th, 2017, The Dangers of Ignorance. Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Right Side. Shane and Patrick are here, as per usual. Welcome back.
Good to be back again. I'm back at home, back from the cabin, so if audio quality is better, it's probably you're not imagining it.
That's right. Audio quality for The Right Side. Got through bias, sensationalism, the mainstream media, in the news. Just a bit of a reminder to everyone, a couple weeks back we talked about the woman in Toronto who attacked someone with golf clubs in a Canadian Tire store, pledged allegiance to ISIS, and the media didn't talk about that at the time as a terrorist attack. Well, this Tuesday she was found guilty of, I believe it was 8 charges of terrorism and pleading allegiance to ISIS. So there we have it. That's what we aim to do. We aim to talk about what the media isn't talking about and get ahead of the media on many of these stories, which has happened in that case and has happened before. So
yeah, and she definitely said, quote, "I don't believe in your law." That's quite something.
Yeah, and if honest journalism had been done from the very outset of that case, that likely would have come out, and it wouldn't have been a huge surprise when the case went to court this week, and so many people heard about it. But because of the dishonest media promoting their agendas and bias against various facts in real life, we end up not getting the full side of the story. So that's what we're going to be doing this week.
Yeah, it's quite amazing, actually, because we don't have any special connections or contacts in the media or whatsoever, but we seem to still be ahead of them on a lot of these issues.
Oh, yeah. I mean, even on the Senate accountability stuff, when Trudeau was interviewed on the West Block, I think we talked about that previously. So, In any case, let's go. What do you got for BC this week?
Well, BC, this is probably less to do with bias in the media, but it's definitely a very, very big issue and something that a lot of people need to talk about more, especially since this is such a problem that happens in BC every year. And no, I'm not talking about the Canucks failing in the NHL, but this is actually something even more serious than that, and that is that preventable wildfires are being caused due to, quote, complacency and ignorance. So there have been so far about 500 wildfires in BC so far in 2017, and more than 2/3 of them were human-caused, according to the BC Wildlife Service. So on Thursday, crews began battling 2 new fires, one on Vancouver Island and another near 100 Mile House, which quickly grew to 140 hectares in size, then expanded to nearly 400 hectares just a few hours later. And if I look on the BC wildfire map, that current wildfire is actually expanded even further than that, and it's now up to 1,800 hectares. In just a couple days since this article came out. So it's definitely worth noting that these fires can grow very fast, very quickly.
You guys are having in Alberta 2016.
Yeah, and with the fire danger at extreme in some parts of the province, campfire bans are still in place, and officials are pleading with the public to behave responsibly and follow restrictions. Definitely, quote, definitely within a certain percentage of the population, there's an air of indifference. Some are just oblivious as well, said Jeff Bush, who is an assistant chief with the West Vancouver Fire and Rescue Services. Said Kevin Shrepnick, which was a chief fire information officer with BC Wildfire Service. He said most human-caused fires can be traced back to a recklessly discarded cigarette butt or a badly extinguished campfire. It's not often we see these as being done intentionally in the form of arson, just due to complacency and ignorance. And he said despite the late arrival of summer, much of the province is already tinder dry and at high risk of igniting. Um, so it's worth noting that there are a ton of wildfires that are happening, and there are currently, according to the BC Wildfire Service, there is currently at least 8 that are really huge, over 1,000 hectares each in different parts of the interior. Um, so it's a very big issue right now, and it's probably just going to get worse as the summer goes on until some rain happens. Um, so last year, the province spent 122 million fighting just over 1,000 wildfires, and 54% of those were human caused. And according to data, the 2015 fire season was even more devastating. It cost 287 million, which is more than twice the 10-year average. So just yesterday, the province of BC declared a state of emergency, as the wildfires have been burning out of control through most of the interior. In a statement, the province said the extended weather forecast is calling for continued hot, dry weather with risks of thunderstorms in many parts of the province. And nearly 2,000 BC firefighters are continuing to fight the aggressive wildfires, and they're going to be joined by hundreds more from across the country in the coming days. Apparently, 260 more firefighters are due to arrive in BC by Monday or Tuesday, and Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall said his province was sending 3 aircraft and 30 more firefighters as well. So what does this mean for most of the province? Well, so far, about 7,000 people in the interior and Caribou regions have been forced from their homes, with more to be expected. Already that number's out of date, because as of recording, evacuations remain in place for the entire towns of Cache Creek and Ashcroft, which if you're in other parts of the country or outside of the country and you don't know BC that well, Cache Creek and Ashcroft are just approximately 45 minutes west of Kamloops, which is just northeast of Vancouver, a couple hours northeast of Vancouver. Places near Williams Lake, 100 Mile House, as well as southern in Princeton and Harrison Hot Springs are also being evacuated, and lots of roads are being shut down, including parts of the Trans-Canada Highway near Kamloops, and of course the Highway 97, which is going north to Williams Lake, due to the fast-moving fires. Now, with the province continuing to burn, it's suspected that almost all of the biggest and the most devastating forest fires are caused by people. And the question remains, what can we do about it to prevent it from happening in the future?
You know, that's a very interesting question because, you know, you look back to the Alberta Fort McMurray wildfire and you see that it was caused by negligence and, you know, canceling of contracts days before the fires were beginning, breakdowns in communications from being able to get in front of the fire and control it and prevent it from entering Fort McMurray. And, you know, I think that also something that could be done is to rely on people who are out in the field, so to speak, to rely on their expertise. Because let's face it, some government official in Victoria or Edmonton isn't going to, you know, have the necessary knowledge about where to direct resources to build a fire strategy. That needs to come from people who are experienced within the forestry sector, I believe, at least.
Yeah, and in the most fire active regions as well, especially in the Caribou region of BC, because that's where most of the wildfires take place, and most of the devastating ones happened. And of course, a couple of years ago, most of them were in the south in the Okanagan area. But all of that smoke, it could be seen as far north as Red Deer in Alberta, and that's quite a distance away. And
oh, yeah.
It can affect a lot of people if these fires aren't contained. And I think a lot of it may come down to just people that are out and about, and they're not being safe with their cigarettes and their campfires, and they don't. they probably have the idea of, what could possibly go wrong. It's just one little fire. They don't realize that it can grow very quickly if it's not attended to.
Right.
And with this season, with the weather that we're having, it's really dry out there, and this stuff is going to spread really fast.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately, I think we can't control the weather. We know that much. There's going to be alarmists in the media, I think, will look at this and say, oh, climate change and whatnot. At the CBC, I know they have a podcast specifically about this and wildfires, but
yeah, and I know that the federal Liberal government in parts of question period a couple months back were attributing a lot of natural disasters like floods and wildfires to climate change, when it's more likely that wildfires just happen because of the dry normal summer heat and that's in the air that have been happening for ages.
Right.
And if a summer is just drier than normal, that just means there's probably going to be more wildfires.
And one thing lots of people overlook when we're talking about climate is that these folks are using the benchmark of 100 or 150 years for climate change. Well, in reality, you have to look at the geologic timescale going back millions or billions of years as to where the Earth is in terms of its climate. In fact, in the 16 and 1700s, we were actually in a mini ice age, and the Industrial Revolution is credited with ending that ice age. So we're actually just warming up, but we're much cooler than we have been at various times in Earth's history. And, I think anyone who's interested in that should really look back at past temperature records going back millions of years to see what conditions used to be like in North America, and you'd be quite surprised.
Mm-hmm. So what can we really do as ordinary people to start combating these wildfires and make it so that things like Fort McMurray wildfire doesn't happen? Well, I think a lot of it is making sure that you're in control of your anything that can light a fire in the summertime, because a lot of these are human caused. So it means that someone's being stupid with their fire, and they can't be. So what can governments do to really curb that, do you think?
I think if you're gonna put it in that frame, it needs to come down to a perhaps better signage entering the provincial and national parks. I know that fires are tightly controlled in national parks, less so in provincial parks, but even at campgrounds, I think provinces could maybe step in that direction.
Yeah, I think there needs to be more of an education campaign, especially because, this is talking about millions of dollars of damage. This is something that if you even spend just 1 or 2 million upon, and it stops even just one of these huge fires, it can make a really big difference.
Indeed, it can.
It's talking about, we all hear Justin Trudeau talking about infrastructure spending and spending so that you don't have to do it later. This is one where I think it actually would be a good idea to spend money on the infrastructure to put in place to stop all these wildfires from happening, because they're going to happen every year. And the less of them that there are, the less money that you're going to have to spend cleaning them up.
All righty. You ready for some Alberta news?
Yeah, let's cross the Rockies.
All right. So Alberta credit rating is being maintained, but DBRS is concerned about growing debt in the province. With the Bank of Canada talk about raising interest rates in the coming week, Alberta has once again come under the microscope for its borrowing practices. DBRS Limited says that Alberta's rating will remain at AA high, but the long-term ratings have been changed to negative from stable, and downgrade could be possible within the year. The reasoning for this is that Alberta continues a sustained deficit spending and shows no path to balance in the future. Just as with personal credit cards and credit ratings, that affects how much you can borrow and how much you pay on the interest on the borrowed money. And while the NDP government says that the books can be balanced by 2024, DBRS is not convinced. The Alberta government doesn't see this as a problem because, in their view, Alberta is still better off than the rest of the country. Finance Minister Joe Ceci said this week that Alberta's economy is expected to lead the country this year in economic growth, and jobs are returning. Our balance sheet remains the strongest in Canada, and we continue to have the lowest debt to GDP ratio among the provinces. He also points out that our credit rating is among the highest in Canada. Well, last I checked, I think BC posted a surplus, a small surplus this year, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. And just before the election, of course, they rushed out financial reports that there was a surplus. Now, of course, many people look at surpluses and they say, well, how many assets did you have to sell off for that to happen? Especially with the change in government, you never know if you can really tell if they've politicized
Right,
or not.
but
I think
but there was
BC
a
in general
surplus before this update, yes?
yeah, yeah, and
Okay.
BC has generally been on the in the black in the budget books.
Saskatchewan too, to a
Hmm.
lesser degree, but and see, this is where this story takes a turn, because you'll see that Joe Ceci says that our balance sheet is the best in the country. Well, if our balance sheet was the best in the country, we wouldn't be this far in debt. We wouldn't have these huge deficits that are requiring us to spend for and borrow for day-to-day operations in the Alberta government. And also, I think just saying that, okay, we can take a credit rating downgrade, we're still better off than the rest of the country. I think that's a fairly lackadaisical way of looking at it, because just because you're better off than the rest of the country doesn't mean that's a good thing. Anytime a credit rating is talking about being downgraded, there is a reason for that. And, downgrades are never good, because that just means it costs more to borrow money. And in the event that you do need to borrow money, such as for a major infrastructure project or natural disasters, perhaps, you're going to be paying more for that money. So while the media doesn't really cover these updates from the credit rating agencies, they do less diligence and are actually kind of ignorant of the fact that Joe Ceci is basically brushing this off as just business as usual, when credit rating downgrades should not be business as usual, or potential credit rating downgrades should not be business as usual. And, it kind of strikes into a balance the whole relationship between the NDP government and the media, because you see the NDP government on one side here, and they are just kind of brushing this aside. But on the other side, you have this one story here talking about this. And at the very end of this story, there's a short blurb from Wild Rose leader Brian Jean, who basically comments on this. But at the end of the day, the focus is, of course, on the NDP government brushing it aside. The only comment that was inserted from Brian Jean is he says that the NDP should take steps to reduce spending, and another credit downgrade, our sixth within just 2 years, would severely hurt borrowing rates and core government services. So as you can see, the opposition here basically gets one paragraph at the end of the story, while the credit rating downgrade and the NDP brushing it aside takes up the other, I guess, 90% of the story. So
Yeah, and when you have the finance minister saying that, oh, well, we're still among the best in Canada, that doesn't really say much when you think about it, because the rest of Canada could have probably downgraded as well. Maybe I don't know particularly, but it means that by him saying that, it means that he doesn't have anything better to say about it.
that's right.
As in that, oh, well, we've been able to increase this and keep our credit rating very good. He's only been able to say that it's still better than a lot of the other provinces in Canada. When you look at some of the economies of the other provinces of Canada, it's no wonder that they're still among the best. You'd have to fall pretty far to get worse than a lot of them, especially probably the economies in the Atlantic Canada, where they're having real trouble with economic growth, and
Yeah.
they have been for quite some time.
And this just reeks of a whole lack of pride in maintaining a strong economy. Because if you are in charge of a provincial economy as diverse and as powerful as Alberta's is, and you are willing to just take this downgrade or news of this downgrade and brush it aside and not have the attitude of that you are in charge of this economy and you're going to make it the best that you possibly can, it kind of sends mixed signals, and that could be another reason why investment is leaving the province. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens on this, if there's further credit rating downgrades this year or subsequent ones next year. But all right. So,
let's hope not.
So as we were recording on Canada Day, something else happened.
Yeah. Before we say this, did you have a good Canada Day, Shane?
I did.
And I think I did as well. And I think a lot of people did. But certainly one person who didn't have a good Canada Day was probably Justin Trudeau, who actually did one of his, occasional slip-ups of the tongue. Anyone who's watched him in Question Period knows that he trips over his speech quite a bit. But he certainly did something pretty interesting on Canada Day that had a lot of people talking. So to celebrate Canada's 150th birthday, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau gave a speech to a cheering crowd in Ottawa on July 1st, highlighting all of the provinces and territories, all except for one. And I don't think I need to give you three guesses as to which one it would be.
It was Quebec, wasn't it?
Well, I guess you might need a second guess then. So from Trudeau's speech, he said, "We may live in British Columbia, Yukon, the Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Nunavut, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, or Newfoundland or Labrador. But we embrace that diversity while knowing in our hearts that we are all Canadians." So it turns out that Trudeau's speechwriters had actually put Alberta in that list, and it may never be clear if Trudeau simply forgot to mention the province of over 4 million people, or if he deliberately excluded it, but it's something that certainly created a lot of buzz over the social media, and I think many either excused it as a slip of the tongue, but many viewed it as bringing up the age-old criticism dating back to Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, that the Liberals, and Trudeau prime ministers in particular, don't care about the West, especially Alberta. So, a lot of the articles that covered the issues mentioned that Trudeau apologized for the slip on Twitter, but they didn't actually include what the apology was. And I think if I read it out here, you'll probably see why. So, in question, it was, quote, "Got too excited somewhere over the Rockies. Sorry, Alberta, I love you. Happy Canada Day." Now, if someone said that to you, say you're on a date with someone and you showed up maybe an hour late or so. If you went to say, "Oh, sorry, I got excited somewhere over the downtown area and on my way over. Sorry about that. I still love you. Happy Canada Day." Would she probably slap you in the face if you said that? So it's not really that much of an apology, I think. And soon after the gaffe, before actually apologizing, Trudeau and his wife specifically went over to Peter Mansbridge and the CBC staff who were on site and doing their newscast from there about all the Canada Day celebrations. And he ended up doing an impromptu interview with many hugs, handshakes, and smiles because Mansbridge, who of course is retiring, that was his last main newscast, and he wanted it to be the July 1st Canada 150 celebrations. So during the interview, he didn't actually ask Trudeau about the slip-up, but after he left and later on, he mentioned in his newscast that he thinks it was a, quote, "simple mistake," and, quote, that he's apologized for it. But he also mentioned it quite a few further times to try and excuse away the slip. And of course, later on, Mansbridge then talked to CBC political analyst Rosemary Barton and tried to get her to weigh in on the issue and get her opinion on, quote, if he turned it around enough. Barton then said that it was a, quote, honest mistake, and that it was, quote, unfortunate that it was Alberta that he forgot, because then the Conservatives will be able to jump all over the Prime Minister, as they have in the past, suggesting he doesn't think enough about Alberta when there's an oil downturn or some sort of problem there.
All right, I have to
End
stop
quote.
you right there. There are two problems with that. The first one is that it's just such blatant bias from the CBC right there, in that, first, because the Conservatives will be able to jump all over the Prime Minister. That's number one. Number two is that some sort of problem there. It's almost as though this is being said that the CBC analyst in question believes that Conservatives are quick to blame the Trudeau government for any sort of problem that goes on in Alberta.
And by saying some sort of problem, it marginalizes any real problem that actually happened, such as the Fort McMurray wildfire and a lot of other stuff that have happened in Alberta recently.
That's right.
Yeah. So, I mean, having the senior CBC reporters who really should know better and have been doing this for ages, having them brush the problem under the rug and then take jabs at the Conservatives and Alberta's economic problems, it's something that the media should really not be doing. The media's job, of course, is to report the news, not to try and get us to forget about it. And certainly to not take such an obvious partisan stance about an issue that will anger a lot of people in the West who have already felt quite marginalized by the federal government's decisions. Like, when I saw the video, you would think that quote that I read from Rosemary Barton, you may think that I was actually, I might have been trying to exaggerate on that. No, those were the exact words that she said. I listened to it 5 separate times just to make sure I could get the wording right, and that's exactly what she said. And that's what her excuse was for what Trudeau said, was that it's unfortunate that he forgot about Alberta because the Conservatives will jump on the Prime Minister for it, and that he doesn't care enough about Alberta. It's like, really? That's the spin you're going to put on it?
Yeah, and when I first saw this had happened, I actually got a quick little chuckle out of it, because of course if it's going to be one province, it's going to be Alberta, like you said. And the second reason is I imagine that this story would take this exact same path that it took, and it did. And I mean, a Canada Day broadcast to ask if he turned it around enough to start analyzing this situation. I don't know. That shouldn't have been on the Canada Day broadcast. And in all honesty, it should have just been talked about the mistake that it was. And they probably are the ones who caused us to do this story, because if they had just reported on it as it actually had happened and didn't show their bias towards Trudeau, we wouldn't be talking about this right now.
Yeah, after all, we're trying to cut through the media bias and sensationalism, and this right here is a clear example of media bias. Yep. Whatever political views you might have, I think not giving the full story, full credit on this is really doing a disservice to the Canadian public, especially because the Canadian public is what funds the CBC.
Indeed. All right, are we ready for something else that doesn't have the full perspective on it, but yet is being reported gleefully in the media?
Yeah, and this is probably the biggest story that's come out this past week.
Right.
So go right for it.
All righty. So the government has formally apologized to Omar Khadr. Meanwhile, Andrew Scheer condemns this as a quote-unquote disgusting payout. Quoting from the article, the federal government has formally apologized to former Guantanamo Bay prisoner Omar Khadr, confirming Friday a financial settlement has been reached to end ongoing legal action. So before we go into a little bit more about what actually happened here, here's a little bit of a history regarding Omar Khadr. Omar Khadr was born in Canada in 1986. In 1985, his father was arrested in connection with the bombing of the Egyptian embassy in Islamabad, Pakistan. Khadr Sr., being a Canadian citizen, drew the attention of the then Chrétien government. Jean Chrétien raised the issue with the Pakistani government, and Khadr Sr. was released. The family then returns to Canada in 1996 for a short period and then moves to Afghanistan, where they live with Osama bin Laden. While this is happening, the children, Omar Khadr included, received terrorist training, and the family made annual trips to Toronto to visit family and raise money for al-Qaeda. Fast forward to 2002, the United States and Canada are in Afghanistan fighting the war on terror. On July 27, 2002, a U.S. unit assaulted a Taliban compound containing Omar Khadr and other terrorists. U.S. forces are injured, and ultimately, U.S. Army Medic Sergeant First Class Christopher Spear is killed by a grenade that was thrown by Omar Khadr. Khadr is then shot but remains alive and was transferred to U.S. custody. After being detained and questioned in Afghanistan, he was transferred to the prisoner of war camp at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. In 2003, under the existing Chrétien government, Canadian intelligence forces questioned Khadr in Cuba. Through 2005 to 2010, we see a number of legal battles against the Canadian government levied by Khadr under the guise that his charter values were threatened. In 2010, jurors of a U.S. military court find Khadr guilty on 5 counts of war crimes and is sentenced to 40 years in prison. The war crimes are, of course, because he attacked a U.S. Army medic, which it is against the rules of war to attack a U.S. Army medic after the battle has ended, because, of course, medics have traditionally in the past been the ones to go into the battlefield, see if anyone is alive, and transport them to safety. Following this, Khadr was sentenced to 40 years in prison, and a pretrial deal limited his sentence to 8 years. Under this agreement, he was also to be repatriated, which of course means being brought back to Canada after serving 1 year in a U.S. facility. In April of 2012, Khadr's transfer orders are signed by the Obama Department of Defense, and he serves a year at the Millhaven Institution near Kingston, Ontario. In 2013, he's transferred to the maximum security prison in Edmonton. In 2014, he has a successful appeal and is transferred to the medium security facility in Bowden, Alberta, which is south of Red Deer. And in April 2015, Khadr is granted bail in Edmonton and later released in May. So while all this was happening, a U.S. civil court ordered that the Khadr family pay $102 million to the widow of Sergeant Christopher Spear and the family of the other soldier injured in the 2002 attack. What's often missing from the media coverage is the fact that several were injured in the attack and that Khadr took part in, and there was indeed one killed. One killed who left a widow and 2 children. The government this week said, when issuing their apology, "On behalf of the Government of Canada, we wish to apologize to Mr. Khadr for any role Canadian officials may have played in relation to his ordeal abroad and resulting harm," Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale and Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland said in a joint statement released to reporters on Friday. In line with the financial settlement, the federal government has paid Omar Khadr $10.5 million. Khadr had initially sued the federal government for $20 million for breaching his civil rights.
That's a lot of money.
It really is. It really is. But the story just continues to get worse. The government also went on to say it's not about previous behavior on the battlefield in Afghanistan. It's about the acts and other decisions that the Canadian government took against Mr. Khadr after he was captured and detained. Conservative opposition leader Andrew Scheer called the deal disgusting and a secret deal that was put together by the government. Scheer also rightly states that any blame for the former Harper government is wrongly placed. It was indeed the Chrétien government who allowed Khadr's father and family to come to Canada. It was the Chrétien government who was in power when the attack happened, and it was the Paul Martin government that allowed CSIS to interrogate Khadr while he was at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. This issue even had former Prime Minister Stephen Harper jumping into the discussion via Facebook and Twitter, which was a post that gained over 12,000 shares and 28,000 likes. The former Prime Minister said, "The government today attempted to lay blame elsewhere for the decision to conclude a secret deal with Omar Khadr. The decision to enter this deal is theirs and theirs alone, and it is simply wrong. Canadians deserve better than this. Today my thoughts are with Tabitha Spear and the families of all Canadian and Allied soldiers who paid the ultimate price fighting to protect us." The former Prime Minister makes an excellent point regarding his thoughts about being with Tabitha Spear and the families of all Canadian and Allied soldiers who gave the ultimate sacrifice in the war on terror. Along with this, the Rebel has also begun a crowdfunding campaign for the Spear family. They launched a website at spearkids.com with the aim of raising $1 million. A day into their funding, they were at a total of $16,666 Canadian dollars, And while the Canadian government is busy paying a former terrorist, private citizens have risen and are sending money to the Speer family. That is, of course, the Canadian government is using taxpayers' money to pay former terrorists. This story ultimately sets a dangerous precedent for any potential terrorist with Canadian roots, because while not all media will talk about the family involved or how massive the settlement is, there are those who are willing to talk about it. Commentator Andrew Lawton has called for Khadr to be treated as an enemy combatant and tried for treason. The reason for this is because he picked up arms against Canada and our allies, and as per the criminal code, anyone who assists an enemy at war with Canada or any armed forces against whom Canadian forces are engaged in hostilities, whether or not a state of war exists between Canada and the country whose forces they are, is guilty of high treason, which carries a life sentence. What makes this worse is this deal that the federal government made was not mandated by the courts. It was the government attempting to get ahead of the issue and put it to bed. The story reeks of incomplete facts as perpetrated by the media. Khadr is often labeled a child soldier or the victim of a harsh prison sentence, but it appears as though the vast majority of journalists covering Khadr aren't aware of World War II and the Convention of Prisoners of War. Canadians are already split on the Khadr stories and could do well with some honest reporting and journalism from our media. After all, it's not every day that an entire family revolves around terrorism, including family members that publicly praise Osama bin Laden, that is Khadr's family. So, as you can see, we have a huge issue on our hands with the Canadian government here. It's as though everyone forgot the Convention of Prisoner of War.
And I think when I was talking about it with my own family, I think my mom said it best in that no one should be given just given $10.5 million of government money for something like this. Like, no one should be given $10.5 million for any reason at this point. I think that's far too much money to begin with, and it's another further evidence of the Trudeau government just spending taxpayer money on a lot of different things. You know, it's just another thing to add to the pocketbook.
Yeah.
Even if you're not even considering who it is and what happened, even then, I think even just $10 million for that is way too much.
Khadr was 15 at the time this had happened. And, you know, when you look at previous wars, say World War II, for example, the Germans used child soldiers in that war, and they were detained as prisoners of war. And, I mean, could you imagine if the government of the day, 15 years after World War II had ended, was giving settlements to German prisoners of war? What the reaction would have been?
And look at what happened with the Allies too. A lot of younger kids lied about their age just so they could go and serve,
right,
because it was the right thing to do. And I know that there were a lot of Russian child soldiers that were out there trying to defend their homeland. I mean, that's what war is. A lot of people are going to try and do what they can, but going after an army medic who is trying to help the injured and take note of casualties,
right,
that's something
because the grenade was
very
thrown
cowardly
after Khadr was shot by an American.
Mm-hmm.
So he was already wounded, and the medics were sweeping the building, as they do, and that's when the attack happened that killed Sergeant Speer. And you know, there has just been a multitude of media coverage on this, and it tends to default to the side that it is good for a society to apologize for acts that had happened like this. But as Canadians, we don't even know what happened in Guantanamo Bay to Khadr. There's little evidence.
We didn't
of what
have
happened.
control of it either. I mean, if anything, if anyone should be paying him, it should not be the Canadian government. If he suffered unusual torture practices that are banned by the Geneva Convention, then it should be the U.S. government that pays it, not us.
That's right.
I mean, it's not like the Canadians are in charge of Guantanamo Bay.
Now, Well, we just have to see where this goes, but I think, it just, and there's also the fact that Prime Minister didn't take questions on this when he was away on his foreign trip, and they released this information on a Friday afternoon, of course, to avoid media cycles. So
yeah, they're trying to sweep it under the rug. It's something that the government is tried to do with a lot of the things that they don't really want to be talked about. So much for the transparent and open, fair,
sunny
honest
ways.
Government, right?
And
it certainly may be sunny out there in July, but in government, it's certainly not.
Yeah, and there's another really smelly thing about this story. Khadr gave interviews to the Canadian press that were released on Friday, and these interviews were recorded earlier in the week. So the media knew that this settlement was coming, but didn't release what information they had on it.
Mm-hmm.
So, media, once again, being dishonest and not, all one needs to do is look at the facts here and realize that this is a prisoner of war scenario, and there should be lots more questions being asked of our government, because the government didn't need to make this deal. It wasn't mandated by the courts. And when you put it this way, what kind of precedent does this set? So, anyways,
and it just shows that the ignorance of the issues that are being surrounded, and I think this whole thing is very polarizing to a lot of Canadian people. And
yeah, I think it was something like 53% didn't agree with the payout already. So hence why honest reporting on this would do everyone some good.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that leave us for the word of the week then?
Well, I believe that through all of the things that have happened, I believe that the word of the week is very noteworthy, and that is ignorance. And that is, of course, defined as the lack of knowledge or information, as in he acted in the ignorance of basic procedures. So you see a lot of ignorance in BC, where people are causing wildfires that cause untold devastation. You see that in Alberta, where the government there seems very unconcerned about their credit rating, and you see that in nationally as well, where Trudeau, either through a slip of the tongue, he just forgets Alberta, but then the ignorance of the media to try and cover it up and call it a non-issue, and to say that it's to call it a reason to bash on Alberta and the Conservatives.
Yeah.
And certainly a lot of ignorance regarding the Omar Khadr decision as well.
Indeed. And I think that's a good place to stop for this week. So I will just say that if you guys want full show notes, that can be found at rightsidenews.ca. We're also on Twitter and Facebook at rightsideca. And if you want to subscribe on iTunes, have it automatically delivered to your iOS device, that's at rightsidenews.ca/iTunes. And with that said, thank you for sharing your time with us, and we'll be back next week.
And we will be back with more on the media and how they try and cover up these things. We will share with you all of that news. So stay tuned, and we will see you next week.